everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by PhD candidate Jack Bull and Dr. James David Audlin. How are you both doing today?
Very well, thank
Very
you.
good, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a debate on when was the New Testament written. Jack Bull takes the position that the New Testament was written significantly later. He advocates Marcion priority, that Marcion's Gospel was written first, and the four canonical Gospels are where Marcion's Gospel and Paul's letters are also written significantly later, late first century at the earliest, maybe the earliest, with lots of redactions going on in the second century. And as for Dr. Audlin, he takes a position that the four Gospels were basically written before 70, with the Gospel of John being finished by the 90s, and Paul's letters are also before 70, and he also puts Secret Mark before 70 and other texts before 70, and that's what we're going to be debating today. When was the New Testament written? Okay, so Jack, do you want to go ahead and give your introductory argument?
Yes, sir, pleasure. So I think it's important before we even begin the conversation that I'm primarily speaking of the Gospels as we find them in their current recension in the New Testament, and also the Pauline material as we find them in the canon. We might touch on other New Testament texts, but I feel like if we can agree at least on maybe the bulk of it, then the Apocalypse of John and Jude will look after themselves. So that is primarily what we're looking at. And also, I'm particularly referring to not the Gospel material. So we could talk about Gospel material as well, whatever Papias had, or the sayings of the Lord. But I'm talking specifically about these four Gospels, completed, finished articles. I used to be a proponent of early dating for the New Testament. That was until I got into patristics and began studying the work of people like Ignatius and 1 Clement and the other apostolic fathers. And the biggest thing that struck me as I was reading them was, where is the New Testament? I know it used to keep half the duo of Nestle Alond up all night when he used to wonder where the narrative of Jesus is in the Apostolic Fathers. Why is there no narrative story? And although he never clearly thought about this enough to post date the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament into the second century, I thought about it a little bit more and began researching why there is no evidence of these texts in our friends, the Apostolic Fathers. This immediately led me to Ignatius of Antioch, the subject of my PhD, who is used often for at least a terminus for the dating of Matthew. And in the 7-letter collection, there are some sure signs that he does show evidence of Matthew. But in the 3-letter collection, which I now believe to predate the 7 letters, there is no sign of Matthew. So the question is, did someone remove the gospel sayings, or did someone add them in? And to my mind, it seems like the more we go on in Christian history, the more likely Christians are to want to justify their books and to give them a position in the early church rather than take them out. So that was the first question then, is if they are so early, where are they? Who's got hold of them? And then I came across Marcion's Gospel. And that's something that is received quite well very soon after it's written. People like Justin and Irenaeus know who Marcion is. They interact with his gospel. And I assumed, going back to our normal gospels then, our 4 canonical ones, that they would have the same reception as well, that these authoritative books that were written supposedly by eyewitnesses, or at least someone who knew an eyewitness of Jesus, people would have classified these as authoritative. They would have wanted to quote them. They'd have wanted to spread the sayings of the Lord and the stories of his birth, life, and resurrection. And yet again, we find none of it. But when Marcion's Gospel comes along, all of a sudden we get an explosion of material about the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And this seems to me no coincidence. In his book, Resurrection in Early Christianity, Vinzent calls this the beginning of resurrection mania. I prefer to call it the Anastasis Party because I think it has a slightly nicer ring to it. But simply put, there's no Gospels or resurrection to speak of even in the early church fathers. This then leads us nicely on to Paul, who is the biggest proponent of resurrection, Mr. Resurrection himself. And this I had slightly more hope for to date early, because I read in the early church fathers, they know about Peter and Paul. They quote them as authorities. They quote them as apostles. They quote them as followers of the Lord. And so, because they knew who they were, one would assume they know their material. And yet again, we find very little evidence of either Paul and especially not Peter's work. We get a smattering sometimes in 1 Clement of 1 Corinthians. Sometimes we see maybe a hint at Romans. But for the most part, yet again, we are left wanting. So the problem we're left with then is that if we have no external reception of the texts, where did they come from? If our earliest reception of them is really only a response to Marcion's Gospel, that's got to be a problem for those who want to date the Gospels and Paul's text in the 1st century. In addition to that, we then have more specific problems in the case of Luke and the Pauline text and Marcion's recension or collection of the Pauline letters and his recension of Luke. Luke's Gospel is incredibly similar to Marcion's. It shares many of the same characteristics, stories, except for a couple of different things. In particular, a birth narrative. Naturally, Marcion's not going to have one of those. He's not such a fan of the incarnation. And we also have a slightly difficult resurrection story compared to Luke's. And yet, this is something that Luke has put in. Or the other position, which if you date the New Testament in the 1st century, you must assume, is that Marcion took them out. Unless you assume that Marcion and Luke have no connection whatsoever. But I think both stylistically and also from a position of this is the material, they certainly do. Again, if you take then the Gospels, all 4 of them, and you look at where their biggest differentiations are, where their biggest issues are, they have a core text in the middle, which is actually roughly the same as Marcion's. But where they differ most greatly is where Marcion hands us on no information, particularly on the birth and the resurrection, or very little on the case of the resurrection. And that's where the Gospels differ the most. It's my belief that they used Marcion and his first New Testament and his first Evangelion as a template. But because people like Irenaeus and other proto-Catholics were not happy with his material or wanted their own systematization of the Jesus sayings, they used his story and manipulated it to their own ends. Similarly, he also seems to be the first person who collects the Pauline texts. He's the first person to publish them and to give us to us. And yet they differ from the canonical texts we have. So it may well be the case that Paul is 1st century, but it's not canonical Paul, I don't think, because again, so when we look at the stylistic elements, when we look at the vocabulary used, when we look at the grammatical elements, they are far more coherent in the Marcion recension than they are in the canonical one. It's why scholars even now get all up in a tizzy when they talk about the 7 authentic letters of Paul, / the pastoral, / Mother Ons, and whatever else. And at least with the pastorals, we've come to the conclusion that we can let them go for the most part, and most scholarship has. But it's only one more step to realise that the other Pauline texts also show massive issues in the canonical recension. So then, what evidence do we have, internally at least, to date them inside the 1st century? Well, to my mind, there's only 2 arguments. The first is that their namesake, but I think any skeptic can appreciate that just because you're named after an apostle doesn't mean you were written by an apostle. The second is what they internally know about life. So, for example, some say that because it doesn't mention the destruction of the temple explicitly per se, they mustn't know of it yet. Therefore, it might be early. Okay, but by the same principle, if I'm writing a biography of Winston Churchill, I probably won't talk about the mobile phone unless I want to get myself into some scholarly trouble. And lastly, then, people point to Papias. And Papias speaks of the Mattean and the Markan material, and in an extra extract, he talks about Johannine material. But there's no evidence to show what this is. And it's my strong belief that he has gospel material. What we mean by that is sayings of the Lord, or an unsystematized set of words, perhaps even a story of Jesus. We are told that in the Markan narrative, it's an irregular narrative of the Lord, whatever that means. It's quite vague. But it's certainly not a systematized canon, or a systematized gospel, sorry, because no one receives it, and he makes no claim to have that. Only Marcion is the first person to really bring those along. So gospel material, yes. Gospel, no. Similarly, with the Pauline material, it may well be 1st century. It may well trace back to the 1st century. But what it includes, I think, is impossible for us to say, because until the research has fully been done on Marcion and his Pauline recension, I think we're rather in a mess. So to conclude then, if it is the case that the Gospels and Paul all date to the 1st century, you are left with 3 options as to how the Apostolic Fathers receive or use these texts. Either A, they know of them and choose that they're not authoritative and not important to quote from. B, they don't have them, but they do exist. Or C, they don't have them because they don't exist. And the First New Testament truly is published as he coins the phrase, and perhaps even coins the genre of gospel, by Marcion.
All right, Dr. Audlin.
Yeah. Oh no, wonderful, Jack. I'm toying with kidding that you are so convincing. I have nothing to say, but not quite. No, just as a little preamble, absolutely by no means is this a debate. I'm sure Jack will agree that the question, when did these materials, the Gospels, the letters, the Revelation, appear in the form in which we know them, is such a complex question that we really can't answer it authoritatively one way or the other. So my suspicion is Jack and I are going to have a great deal in common, kind of like those Van Graaff circles. We'll have some overlap with the circle and some where we disagree a little bit, but by no means do I feel this is a debate. The common conception, unfortunately, still is that the Gospels, for example, somehow were written by one single author. Each one was written by one single author, that they floated down from the heavens in the form in which we have them today. We tend to think in modern times of authors. I write novels when I'm not busy with Aramaic texts. And we think of authors as sitting there in their closet, writing away until the whole thing is done and it's shipped off to the publisher. And next thing you know, it's a bestseller. It's not quite like that, of course. These Gospels were written in a number of stages, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, impossible to say when actually they originated. So it is in that manner that I think Jack and I will find we have a great deal in common. Now, as I mentioned, I'm my specialty is as an Aramaicist. Of course, I read Greek and the other languages as well, but I specialize with the Aramaic texts. So a great deal of my perspective on this matter comes from that reading. You were discussing Mark there for a while. Mark often is declared the earliest gospel, and it is certainly, in my view, it's certainly early. I am especially fascinated by a letter from Clement of Alexandria that Morton Smith found in the Marsaba Monastery that suggests a number of stages to the finalization of the Markan text. And Clement, in this letter, suggests that there were various versions of Mark written by John Mark. One that would be written based on the oral recollections of Simon, better known as Peter, while he was in Rome, which Clement suggests would have been before his execution, which is usually dated to around 64, but that date can be argued. And then a second version of Mark was developed, so Clement suggests, probably in the late 50s, based on material that John Mark inherited after Simon Peter's execution, including written materials, such that that second version was developed. There then was that second version I should add, excuse me, that second version I should add was later redeveloped into the canonical gospel that we know today. The common dating for that, such as Jonathan Bernier and others, is in the early 70s. And then there is a third, this is the most interesting one, a third version of the Gospel of Mark, so Clement suggests, that is not canonical, that was actually very little published, if at all, that was written probably in the late 50s, early 60s. And this one contains, by what Clement shares, to a long passage and a short passage therefrom, contains material which is quite Johannine in form. So, and this one is the one that is best known by the name The Secret Gospel of Mark. Now, by Coptic Christian records, Mark was executed in 62, possibly 68, but I lean toward the 62 date, which pushes that rather early. Matthew is somewhat later in time as I read the texts. Matthew has relationships with the Hebrew gospel, so-called the Gospel of the Hebrews, that is quoted, referred to by a number of the early Christian writers. And it is noted by several scholars that Matthew and Luke as well, when they use Markan material, just to back up a little bit for those who are not familiar with what I'm talking about, it's generally agreed that Matthew and Luke have two major sources of their texts, one of those being some form of mark, and the other being something called Q. The letter Q stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. So it's a source named source if you follow the German. And Matthew and Luke, especially Matthew, when they use Markan material, it is in what appears to be a more developed form. If you lay down Matthew, Mark, Luke side by side, as in various books they do that, you can see there's a fuller text of that. And it's often been suggested that Matthew may have had access to that third and final version of Mark, the secret gospel of Mark, especially in the resurrection passages, which of course are not apparent in the Gospel of Mark as we have it. Joan Taylor has written extensively on Luke, fascinating material. She's one of those scholars I always find extremely interesting, because whether I agree with her or vehemently disagree with her, she always gets me thinking. And I really appreciate that. One of her relatively recent essays suggests that Luke was written by a woman. She posits with care the possibility that this would be Thecla, the woman who is often associated with Paul, for example, in the non-canonical text about Paul and Thecla. And Thecla, she hypothesizes, may have been the quote-unquote sister wife mentioned in Corinthians as a companion to Paul. Luke, therefore, takes, as I read it, takes the same material that we've been discussing so far, Markan material, Johanna material, but skews it in something more of a Pauline direction. Paul's repackaging of Jesus as a commodity, you could say, was quite to the contrary of the other texts that seem to be more in the apostolic tradition. So Luke, I find personally, dates to around the 60s, later 60s, probably. Now the Gospel of John, which is my specialty. The Gospel of John has a great deal in it to commend it as a very early work. My reading of the Moratorian canon, I'm happy to expand upon that a little later if we wish, suggests that the Gospel of John was begun in the year 42 using eyewitness material from the so-called beloved disciple, who is relatively easily identified in the Galilean Aramaic texts of the Gospel of John, which are my main focus of study. The Syriac texts date to 3 or 4 centuries after Jesus, really irrelevant to this entire conversation. But the Galilean texts, in a dialect that was spoken by Jesus and his contemporaries and died out within less than a century after the destruction of Jerusalem, these materials give us a strong indication that there is eyewitness material in the Gospel of John. In John 5:2, for example, the pool of Bethesda is described in the present tense in Greek as well as in the Galilean Aramaic. And the configuration of the city walls that we find in the Gospel of John suggest the pre-66 configuration of the city of Jerusalem. In about 66, a new wall was completed that brought in area north of the Damascus Gate into the city, but that Jesus' execution takes place outside the city walls suggests that, at least in the perspective of the author as he wrote this material, it was outside the city, was north of the Damascus Gate. And it was only in 66 that was included within. So that to me suggests an early origination of the gospel. Paul Anderson, who is another one of those authors who I pay attention to, even when I disagree with him, suggests a number of passages in Luke Acts, the two-pronged work, Luke being part 1, Acts being part 2, that contain material that, in his view, is based on early versions of the Gospel of John. So if Thecla or some other female author, as Jones suggests, is indeed the author of Luke Acts and was a companion of Paul, that again suggests an early dating. John Robinson, in his renowned work Redating the New Testament, suggests as well that there is material, the sheep gate as a present reality, to quote directly from Robinson. Charles Scobie as well, in his work The Origins and Development of Samaritan Christianity, gives a very interesting argument. He suggests that the use in the Gospel of John of the Greek term that comes into English as Judeans, Iudaioi in Greek, as well as the Aramaic antecedent to this, does not suggest, in his view, as is often argued, a much later debate between Gentile anti-Semitism and an anti-Judean bias, but rather that it focuses from a period in which that debate had not even yet arisen. And so that too suggests to me that there is an early origination of much of the material that we have in the Gospel of John. But in all of these cases, in these Gospels, they were worked over, they were redacted, they were interpolated, material in them was excised. I find in a facile comparison of the Aramaic text with the familiar Greek Textus Receptus, so many amazing separations. In an earlier program, I pointed out how the beginning of chapter 10 in the Greek is about the good shepherd, but in the Aramaic, the Galilean Aramaic, there's no good shepherd. It's a continuation of the discussion at the end of chapter 9. There's several paragraphs of material between chapter 19, the entombment of Jesus, and chapter 20, the morning of the resurrection, material that we don't find in later versions. So just using John as an example of this material is worked over, such that that's where I do tend to agree with Jack, because the early church fathers, when they don't refer to these gospels as we know them, it's because, and Jack is right here, they did not exist yet. I'm talking here about earlier material that was later worked into the form in which it is familiar today. So I'll leave it there for now. We can open up some of these smaller parts of the larger discussion later.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think it just depends, I suppose where the disagreement, that you're right, it's going to be in the minutiae of what do we describe as the material.
Precisely.
And I suppose the difference is going to be between us that I believe it's scant and you think it's less scant.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose would be the assumption. But just to address a few of the points you made, I suppose, particularly on Q, the famous Q. I had the great pleasure of meeting Kloppenborg at a conference the other day, which was amazing. It's like when you don't meet your heroes, but he was one that you can meet and still love. The problem I have with Q is that it seems to me that Q, if anything, is Marcion. It seems to be the basis and has all the core elements with which the other gospels use and know about. And the biggest issue I have with Q is that it's so hypothetical that we begin to work with so much sand that any building or hypothesis we try and build upon it just falls through our fingers. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it said. We don't know where it was, who wrote it, when it was written. And it almost just, I think, impedes scholarship because they spend so much time trying to build around something that they don't know.
Right. I agree.
And they're chasing their own shadow, I think.
I agree.
Then on to some of the other parts. Joan Taylor, again, I highly recommend as well. I had the great privilege of being taught by her. And let me tell you, that was just the best. But on the subject of the authorship of these texts and the hypothesis, I agree that she is cautious, right? I agree that she's cautious in saying Nicholas. She is by no means out there stamping her fist. But I think when we're talking about authorship of these texts, we enter again into something that hinders scholarship. And it happens, I notice even more with my area in some of the Apostolic Fathers as well, is we get so bogged down in trying to work out a hypothetical author that we often miss the significance of the content that's in a text. And I don't think that we can say with any certainty, even more so with the Gospels than with some of the Apostolic Fathers, who wrote what. Or even what gender they were, more specifically. I don't think there's any ideas of gender roles or an example of gender given of the author in any of the texts. And I think it's interesting as well that you mentioned about the Mauritanian canon, or the Mauritanian fragment, sorry, and the canon it mentions, because to some extent that almost shoots you in the foot again, because Matthew and Mark are confused sometimes in the Mauritanian canon. We know Luke and John are in it, that's certain. But when we come to Matthew and Mark, there is a little bit of confusion, as with 1 John, 2 and 3 John, and then it includes the Apocalypse of Peter, which is rogue. And so again, when we're talking about New Testament, when we're talking about like these finalized texts, even the reception of these texts from even until you get to people like Origen is confused. Okay, you could say by Origin, at least they know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, probably in the canonical form we have them. But when you're looking at the New Testament list used, or the canon list used by our Apostolic Father friends, and also by these early canon lists, there is much debate about what goes in them and what's authoritative, and who's deciding that. Well, probably it looks like just individuals at some points. But I suppose that the key crunch of this, though, is that you only briefly alluded to the fact that the main thrust of my argument, which is that I don't know where these texts are in the 2nd century. I know where they are after Justin and Irenaeus, but there's 140 years before Marcion where they don't seem to be doing anything. And again, if they exist, I have to assume, particularly in the case, and you didn't mention Paul very much, particularly in the case of Paul, though, I have to assume that if they regard him as authoritative, as an apostle, and as a significant person, they would want to use him. They'd want to quote from him. They'd love to just get involved and affirm. It does two things. It both affirms the Pauline letters as authoritative, but it also affirms their own authority in that succession of Paul. And yet we don't find it. In addition, I think it's interesting that we have some of the sayings of the Lord, which are mentioned in the New Testament, in the Gospels. And again, where have they come from? Are they making them up? Like, do they have a different tradition? Is someone else sort of is someone else putting these sayings in for funsies and to screw everyone else over? I don't think so. And then again, the last point that I want to home in on again is the resurrection issue, because if we believe the Gospels are all early and that Paul is early too, there's no doubt that for all 4 of the Gospels and for Paul, the resurrection is one of the most central elements to it, unless we look at Mark 16:8 and Marcion's Gospel, where it's sort of not a central point and it sort of just gets left into the wilderness. They're the only 2 Gospels assumptions that I can see as being early, because they're the only 2 that don't mention the resurrection, which doesn't seem to be a point of contention or a point of significance for the Apostolic Fathers, who are only interested in the crucifixion. They're also not particularly interested in the incarnation. Again, we see mixed interest in that. The only thing they're all central about is the crucifixion. It seems to be the only thing that they want to speak about, which again seems to fly in the face of Pauline theology. Not to mention some of the more specific details. I mean, one example I think of is that Ignatius of Antioch wants to talk about slaves can never be freed. They should never seek their freedom. It's wrong for them to be freed. Well, that flies in the face of Paul, right? That's going in the opposite of Paul's direction, who says, well, if you can get freedom, you probably should. Ignatius says it's evil. So again, where is the wrestling with these texts if they are present and they are authoritative? And again, I think it falls into one of the 3 categories. They didn't have them because they were written and weren't published. They didn't have them because they didn't exist, or they did have them, and this is the biggest problem, I think. They did have them and they just ignored them. They didn't view them as authoritative. They thought they were just say la vie. And I think that's got to be the question we ask. And I can more than accept a position where we bring the dating of the New Testament back earlier and earlier. But you can only do that when you can show evidence that it's there. I mean, we have manuscript evidence for them being 1st century. I think the internal evidence actually is lacking. You mentioned the pool and how it shows a 66 configuration of the city. Again, I watch a lot of Viking Progress on Netflix. They're not going to put, well, they do sometimes, but they try not to put historically inaccurate things into it, right? Again, if someone pulls out a gun against Alfred the Great, there's a problem there. I think that we've got to credit these authors with a sense of literary intelligence, that even to create the genre as gospel, to write, particularly in the case of John, which you mentioned, this outstanding narrative actually that creates the new Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 in John 1, and 4 days later we go to the wedding, and it's all very lovely. These are not stupids, these are Shakespeare's, these are really clever guys, and one would assume that they are perfectly capable of reconfiguring or assessing the earlier situation of a city if necessary. And actually on some occasions they do make mistakes. I mean, you look at the beginning of Luke. So Marcion's Gospel only gives us, in the 15th year of Tiberius, Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea, Jesus ascent into Capernaum. But Luke adds in this extra stuff about the high priest being Zechariah, who belongs to the priestly division of, I forget now. That'll come back to me. But you see that this thing about the high priest being Zechariah, I mean, he clearly has the wherewithal to put that in, unless you think Marcion took it out. But again, why would he do that? There seems to be no great purpose to me that he would do that. In fact, Marcion includes
taken it out because it's incorrect.
Exactly, right? So, but clearly they're attempting it, even though it's wrong. And also in the case of Marcion, I believe that his gospel can be fairly trusted because he gives us things in his gospel that I think he might have disagreed with. For example, he talks about how Jesus still had the sign about King of the Jews above his head. I don't think that would be a particularly Marcion favourite. He also talks about the drawing of the sword. Again, not a Marcion favourite. I think he would prefer Jesus to be out and out pacifist, everyone be Greenpeace sort of styly. But yet he includes them. And I think that shows an authenticity and an integrity to Marcion, that he inherits material clearly from somewhere and perhaps systematizes it rather than creates. Whereas we know in the case of Luke, like you said, the mistake, but also in the case of John, he's definitely creating. Right, he is definitely making things up. And so Marcion, at least for that point, it sounds to me of Occam's razor that the earliest thing would be biography, the latter would be theology, and one builds off the other.
Yeah, if I may refer to your question, Jack, your rhetorical question, where are the references in the early church fathers to the Gospels? My view is they were aware of these Gospels, but there are two reasons, in my view, why they would not be quoted as much as we might expect. One of those is publication, that they were not necessarily being published as widely early as we might think. I think that the large portion of the gospel texts was written earlier, but publication dates were later. By John, for example, while John the presbyter was apparently writing these in the mid first century, between approximately 42 and 68, Marcion did not return them to Ephesus until the early 90s, and so that puts publication quite late for the Gospel of John. And it's a similar case with Matthew and Luke. So they could not have been in the widest publication as early as we might expect. The second reason is that there's a certain amount of controversy. You are right. There's a great deal of focus on the crucifixion. There's a certain amount of focus on the incarnation, not on the resurrection. And I believe that might have been, at least in large part, because there's a certain amount of controversy about the resurrection. The resurrection, as portrayed in the Aramaic texts, is of, and to a degree in the Greek text as well, is of a persona, a figure who is not familiar to the apostles, whom they do not recognize immediately. And there is some question of identity. I don't want to spend too long on that matter. I only bring it up to suggest that because of the issues, the controversy surrounding the resurrection, there may have been a certain amount of hesitation on the part of these fathers to refer thereto. Now, Ignatius and other scholars do suggest that there was also a great amount of debate as to which Gospels would be considered preeminent, eventually the word canonical. Ignatius and others were pushing hard for the Gospel of John. Others were pushing for the synoptic Gospels. And while this controversy was going on, there might have been also some hesitation in referring to these. Certainly, Jack, go ahead.
Sorry, did you say Ignatius or Irenaeus?
Did I misspeak? I was trying to say Ignatius.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, that I thought
I
you were
always
saying
get
Irenaeus.
my eyes get crossed.
No, I'm more interested now you said Ignatius. I'm more interested, but continue and we'll come back to it.
No, Ignatius also is relevant to the matter, but I was actually referring to, to the other. Oh boy, here we go again. I'm gonna get my eyes crossed.
That's all right. No, I know Irenaeus. Yeah, I mean Irenaeus
Irenaeus.
seems to be the big proponent of the four gospels and the 4 points of the earth, the four
Exactly.
winds, blah 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 blah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. No, no, sorry. I just want to stop you in case it was Ignatius, in which case I was gonna butt in. But yeah, carry on.
No, yeah, no. So for these reasons, I think there was a certain amount of hesitation on the part of these early church fathers to refer to them, and until the divide between the Pauline perspective and the Pauline materials and the more apostolic, is the term I prefer to use, the apostolic perspective on Jesus and materials was healed, which wasn't until about the second or third century do we begin to see fulsome quotations from the Gospels in these early church fathers. You're right, I left out Paul. Just to do a quick lick and a polish, the materials ascribed to Paul in the New Testament, of course, run the whole gamut. Some of them, I think, do trace back to Paul. I tend to think Second Timothy is Pauline in its origins, where a lot of scholars don't. On the other hand, I think some of the other texts that are considered Pauline are not. Second Corinthians comes to mind. So there's a certain amount of back and forth on those Pauline texts that pertains to this as well. The Revelation, we haven't touched on the Revelation. There's a certain amount of confusion on the book of Revelation that I might quickly refer to. It refers supposedly to Domitian, but it actually Domitius Nero would be the name, and that's clearer in the Aramaic version that we have in the Crawford Codex, which is the only Aramaic text of the Gospel of Revelation that isn't so obviously back translated from the Greek. So if it's in the Neronian period, that puts it, as also Jonathan Bernier concludes, between 68 and 70, which is also corroborated by my study of the star configurations, the constellational configurations in the Revelation, which you can use with, for example, NASA has a website where you can put in pretty much any date in history and any longitude and latitude. And if you run it back to approximately when the vision came, it configures pretty nicely. I don't have that material right in front of me at the moment, so I don't want to go into detail, but I can look it up if we wish. But I find the Revelation to be 68 to 70, as do other scholars too. In the Aramaic, it's much more clearly so. The Greek text is horrible Greek, but it back translates into Aramaic very nicely, unlike the Gospel of John, which is written in exquisite Greek. It's superlative Greek, and the Aramaic as well. So just a quick lick and a polish on what you had to say about Paul there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I read Bernier's book as well, who you've mentioned a couple of times, and I think that the biggest problem with the argument is that there remains no evidence in terms of like physical hardy evidence. It's all based on itself. It's all based. It's so secular, and as I said, I think that I credit the authors, the second century authors, with more than enough nous to systematize, particularly if they have got Marcion as a template, some new material into John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, whatever. And until we find that attestation from our early second century friends, or we find a manuscript from the first century, which I think is exceptionally likely, or alternatively, we find Papias, he might be able to help us. Adolf von Harnack claims he found Papias and lost him. That was stupid, but it wasn't entirely his fault. It was World War I kicked off and they moved the library and whatever, and he couldn't find him after the war. But until we find those things, ultimately, I feel like yourself and Bernier and other proponents of even just first century dating for the Gospels, Paul, we can maybe talk about a bit more, but I think you're fighting in the dark, because if this was any other text, I do think that we would be more skeptical of it. But for some reason, when it comes to the canon, I still think that scholarship has a lingering conservative Christian, and I don't mean that because we're all Christians, although I am, but we have a lingering Christianity that's still weighing down our progression. When we look at, again, our earliest evidences, we just can't show any sign of John or any of the other Gospels before Irenaeus, really. Right? We just cannot show that people were using it, they had it. You mentioned the issue of publication. Look, I totally get that that publication takes money, effort, time, and skill, right? To transcribe these things, to produce them, which is why Marcion's in a prime position to do that, because of his wealth and his again, as a merchant tradesman, he gets everything around. He's putting all the best articles, whatever. But even so, we're dealing with, according to the traditional dating, then 50 years, 60 years between the writing of these texts and 1 Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, whatever. And we're still not picking them up. And again, I think it seems likely to me that if someone like Ignatius was Bishop of Antioch and Polycarp was a Bishop of Smyrna, and he might inherit, maybe he might see a letter to the Philippians, who we know he has contact with, and Ignatius might see a letter maybe from Asia Minor because he has contacts as well. Why don't they use them? Like, who's got them? Are we hiding them? Are they literally the secret Gospel of Mark because we just keep them secret? Or actually, do people not have them? And to me, it just seems like Occam's razor in the end. Now, again, I would reverse my position in a moment if someone could show me otherwise using an attestation, reception, or manuscript. But like I say, until we find Papias or otherwise, I don't think we're going to get it. And I think even using Papias's description of the material that he has, he seems to imply, like I said, an irregular narrative, some sayings of some form of Matthew, Mark, and Luke Matthew, Mark, and John, to be fair. So he's got all of the sayings, but he seems to present no systematization of these things into a beautiful narrative that we can read as early Christians. Something akin to what Irenaeus clearly wants to promulgate. But I'd also argue as well that Marcion also inherits his text. I don't think that Marcion is the composer. I think he is also inheritor. I disagree with Vinzent for that reason. I agree with Matthias Klinghardt, who thinks that Marcion didn't compose the gospel, that he inherits it. He might edit it maybe, but he's not the creator or the inventor of the term evangelion.
No.
And I think on the Pauline issue, you've got the same problem, even more so, because you've not just got the Evangelion Luke issue, you've got it in all of the texts of Paul, in particular the readdressing of Ephesians to Laodiceans, which I think is interesting, and then also the different content, some of which flies directly in the face of Pauline theology. In particular, the phrase about whether women should be silent in churches. Marcion says that Paul says the opposite, that women should certainly speak in churches, and that they're the apostles to the atheists and the others and the non-Christians or whatever. So, and how has he got those? Again, I think we can trust Marcion. He includes things in his gospel that I don't think would be up his street. He seems to an air of integrity. In fact, even more impressive, I think, he manages to collect the 10 epistles of Paul, which, excluding the pastorals, which most scholars ended up for a long time thinking were genuine until they now accept the 7. So he seems to have a smell for this. He seems to have a bit of a nose for it. He seems to sort of know what's Pauline. He seems to have contacts of that tradition. And then, a bit later, someone else comes up with another Pauline recension. Also interesting to note that when Tertullian is speaking of his Pauline recension, Marcion's that is, he rarely, or never, as far as I'm aware, brings in the canonical Paul to contradict Marcion. So why is Tertullian not talking about Paul? Why is he not using Paul on Paul action to really finish him off? Let's crush that evil heretic. Now, I think part of it in the 2nd century, in the case of Irenaeus and Justin, is that I'm not entirely sure they have the same concept of heretic. I think that they're actually a bit more kinder than the heresiologists like Hegesippus or Tertullian a bit later in just throwing these people out. And I believe very strongly that the reason why these texts take so long to be published and come into one form is because none of the texts we currently have are probably single epistles or single texts. They are all weldings, meldings, sharings of thoughts, ideas, and concepts. And eventually they come together to produce the canon or Marcions. They're the final two redactions, and then they fight it out to the death to get there. And eventually canonical wins. But I think initially it's been Marcion's. But all of them show signs of corruption even in and of themselves. I don't think Marcion's recension is perfect. I think he has many things to answer for with his issues. But again, it seems like we may be able to trace something back to the 1st century, but it's nothing that we have in its totality by any stretch. And I think the earliest we can hope for is some sayings of the Lord. And don't get me wrong, they're valuable. They're going to be valuable, whatever they are, but we just don't know what they are.
I'm delighted to hear your encomium in favor of Marcion, because, after reading Epiphanius and Polycarp and others who castigate him as entirely unethical, it's interesting to hear, Jack, your perspective on Marcion as showing integrity in his gospel. I'm delighted by that. It occurs to me that we might think about various early texts that probably come from Papias. I would give my eye teeth, I'd give every tooth in my mouth, I'd give it them all, if to get my hands on the complete work that Papias wrote in 5 volumes. It must be a gold mine of information that would help us a great deal. And I'm sure our viewers understand that Jack and I both are basically fumbling in the dark, feeling the shapes in the darkness around us and trying to do our best to figure out what these shapes are. Jack is absolutely right. We have so little material from the 1st century on which we can hang anything firm and solid. But there are a few hints here and there that do help us. And I wanted to refer to, in that sense, to the anti-Marcionite prologues, which, along with the Moratorian, I think are related to the lost materials from Papias's famous 5-volume work. And in one of those passages, it's Vaticanius Reg Lat 14, and I've got the Latin in front of me, but my own translation. Marcion the heretic, when he had been reprimanded by him, which refers to John, because he, that refers to Marcion, had suggested contrary matters, was expelled by John. But Marcion, however, had brought to him, John, the writings and letters sent from the brothers who were in Pontus. This is an early reference to the materials that became eventually the Gospel of John. And Epiphanius refers further to this, that he, Marcion, met with the presbyters who still lived, those who had been taught by the disciples of the apostles of Jesus, and begged to be admitted to communion, but none of them would allow this. So these references are amongst those who suggest that, as you suggest, Jack, that Marcion was very much in the thick of it in the early times, but that he had a relationship with the canonical Gospels that we're familiar with, not only Luke, which is, as you point out, quite similar to Marcion's Gospel, but also to the Johannine materials. And if I can scroll down to it quickly, here we go. In the Panarian, Epiphanius suggests that the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, had compelled John to publish the Gospel, from which he had begged to be excused on the basis of his discretion and humility, and did so only when he was in his old age, more than 90 years old, after his return from exile in Patmos under Nero Claudius Caesar, and after many more years had passed in Asia, which of course refers to Anatolia. So just a few quick passages that I happen to have in front of me that refer to the early origination, using that term loosely, of at least one canonical gospel. Another matter that we haven't gotten into, you've been discussing Marcion, Jack, with great reason. Another matter that we need to get into is the other important gospel, non-canonical gospels, the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas, preeminent among those. The Gospel of Philip quotes verbatim from Paul from 1 Corinthians, and it also is in a number of its logia referring very clearly to the Gospel of John. And I for one, go along with Patterson Brown, in dating the Gospel of Philip quite early. The Gospel of Thomas also, while it doesn't quote directly from any thing that resembles a gospel that we know, nevertheless does have about it all the patent of being an early gospel. This new text that's ascribed to Pontius Pilate that I talked about on an earlier program suggests indeed an early origination of the Gospel of Thomas because of its reference to Mary and Procula making hand copies of it for predicative purposes. So there are here and there are hints at awareness of these texts that become the Gospels that we're familiar with. And as I suggested earlier, Jack, I agree with you. They're not mentioned as fulsomely as we might like in the early writers, but I think the reason for that is a certain amount of hesitation on their part. There was, as I said before, a great deal of controversy, downright struggle between the predominantly Pauline congregations and the more apostolic congregations. And we see some hints and reflections of that in the various letters, both quote unquote Pauline as well as the patristic letters that we have in the New Testament. And until that debate was settled, I see a certain amount of hesitation on the part of these writers. So that's why here, I think we agree. You and I are feeling in the darkness as much as we can, the shapes around us. And any day something might be found in the sands of Egypt that make it all clear. I live for that day, but until we have it, the best we can do is to work with the material we have. And you look at Marcion, as rightly as should. I'm looking at these Aramaic texts of John and other texts as rightly I should, and doing our best to try to make some sense of what little material we have.
So again, I re-emphasize the point though is that the evidence I have is that I can certainly show that Marcion was written at a time because people talk about it, it's attested, it's received, it's spoken about, but I can't do that with the canon. But on the subject of Peter and Thomas, I think they're crucial. I don't agree about the Gospel of Peter. I think it is 2nd century. I think it's mid to late 2nd century, which I think is also Bart Ehrman's position as far as I'm aware, and some others. With Thomas, however, they might find some sympathy with me. Why? Well, because it fundamentally is a sayings business again.
Mhm.
It's not really a gospel. I think that's a misnomer, a disingenuous characterization of the book. The genre of gospel really is these lovely, sweet narratives, or at least at the bare minimum, a narrative. Thomas is not a narrative.
No.
Thomas is a hodgepodge, gobbledygook mess.
Philip, neither is Philip.
Yeah, indeed. And so they I can see as being early. In fact, if you would say to me, Jack, I could hypothesize Thomas's mid to late 1st century. I could say I haven't got any great proof of that, but I can see it because at least we know that there were sayings of the Lord hanging around. We know that we have to have some material to systematize, unless they just make up all the gospel, which I don't think is true. I think they add frills around reality, and so I think Thomas presents to us another Q, as some people have called it, a bit like whatever Papias might have had in his sayings. Again, that's speculation, but Thomas might be a Q answer. But Peter I can't see in that sense. Peter again does present more of a lovely story.
Yeah, I didn't refer to Peter. I wasn't talking about the
I
Gospel.
thought you were talking about the Gospel of Peter. Oh, sorry. What did you mention?
Yeah.
The Gospel of
I was
Thomas
referring to Thomas and Philip.
And Philip. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Apologies. I thought you were talking about the
not at all. No,
sorry.
The Gospel of Peter is a fascinating document. I've gone over that with so much interest, and I haven't fully made up my mind on that gospel as it is. But I wasn't referring to that as much as
on the Gospel
Thomas
on the Gospel of Philip. I think that's again I think that's maybe even later. I think that's late.
Yeah, I know. And I'm a Patterson Brown devotee on that subject of both Philip and Thomas, as showing a great deal of material that suggests they were written indeed early. So, but again, we're fumbling in the dark, and that's, you come to one perspective, I come to another, and that's pretty much how it's going to be.
It's interesting though, because I think that although it's Joan, she's cautious, but there is far too much certainty among scholarship on this subject sometimes, and ultimately I think it's far more productive at this point, because we are so fumbly, to not basically do what Bernier has done, or even to some extent yourself, of say, well, they show signs of being first century, because I do think that I think it just becomes I think it becomes a mute game. I just think that it lacks the external evidence and reception of that. And again, you might be right. Like, don't get me wrong, you could. And I should also make my cards on the table. I'm actually a Christian, so you'd do me a world of favors if you showed that. But I think it's much more useful as academics to provide a terminus for the publication of these texts than it is to posit an earlier state, because an earlier state can't be shown, and so anything else, I don't know where it leads us, because I just think it's so secular. The text is because it says it is, and I don't know where to go with that.
Right. The texts as we know them, and the Greek Textus Receptus, is quite late. That simply is without question. That still as late as the 1600s, they were finalizing the Greek text. The Nestle Aland that you and I and everybody else refer to, I don't need to tell you, Jack, the footnotes at the bottom of all the variants shows how much change went on before that finalized Greek text ever came to light.
Yeah.
But my work, as I said, is with the Aramaic, and I'm not going to try to answer every question with the New Testament, because I can't. I only have one lifetime, so I'm working. So and as you can tell by the color of my hair, I don't have much of that lifetime left. So I have to do the best I can with what I have. And the Gospel of John I seized upon some 50 years ago, and have not let go of it yet. And when I came upon the Galilean Aramaic texts that pretty much everybody has ignored, Metzger has ignored them, even Simon Brock has ignored them, and I can't understand why, because these are revelatory texts. They make it extremely clear the identity of the beloved disciple, make it extremely clear that the perspective that it has on Jesus, his life, his teachings, is very much at variance from the dogma that has become universal in the centuries since. And that in itself has set me on that path of trying to precise as much as I can the history of the origination of the Gospel of John. And there's several stages to that. I won't try to summarize those unless you wish, but there's several stages to that. It was not a simple process by any means, but I still find it to be, to put it as simply as I can, an early text, a text in which a great deal of the material we find in the Gospel of John is from the middle, more or less, of the first century.
Well, I think maybe this becomes just us repeating ourselves. Maybe it's like, until I see someone speak of it or a manuscript, I maybe I'm just too much of a skeptic. Maybe I'm as a Christian as well. Maybe I'm just too much of a skeptic in it. Maybe I just love the cold hard evidence. I think that when I look particularly at my work with Ignatius, I realise that what scholarship tends to do is perpetuate its own narrative, and only really argues about, to some extent, the things it feels comfortable arguing about, rather than some of the things that actually matter. And I think that the Marcionite scholarship is now going to come into its own over the next few years.
I hope so. Marcion, I agree with you. Marcion is so overlooked and needs so much more study. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, and I think Jason Badoon and Matthias Klinghardt and Markus Vinzent, etc., are bringing that. And as we do more research, and this is why I want scholarship to go, is let's have a look at canonical Paul versus Marcionite Paul. Let's see which one's earlier, because at least if we could decide which one was earlier, then we can have an argument about whether it's first or second century, right? That we can only begin those arguments, I think, when we know which Paul is earlier. We can only begin the arguments about the Gospels when we know whether Marcionite Paul shows signs of being earlier than Lucan. Sorry, Marcionite Gospel shows early signs of Lucan Gospel, right? They're the things that need to be done, and these things are done by brute force and manual labor, which is, counting words, looking at grammatical principles. They take multiple languages. They take many hours of study and effort, and that's why I think partly the reason why scholarship has left them alone, not just the Christian element, but also the effort element. I spent 8 hours this morning reading one verse of Ignatius to see how many times it uses a word in the corpus. I mean, like, it's dull. It's really rubbish.
Yeah,
It's not
but
interesting
it's what
scholarship.
we do.
Right, but I think scholars have overlooked it for the more meaty, enjoyable theology stuff. Right, our eyes always want to go there because we can pontificate without any great research to some extent,
Yeah,
without boring research.
I've been more than a week on a single word in Galilean Aramaic. As you know, Jack, Syriac Aramaic is well documented. We've got dictionaries, we got grammars. Galilean Aramaic, despite the work of Sokolov and Christa Miller-Kessler, there's nothing. We have no grammars, no dictionaries of Galilean Aramaic. So I hit a word like the one I've been struggling with for more than a week now, that we simply don't know what it means. And so I'm trying to work with cognates in Arabic and Hebrew and so on, trying to figure out what this word means. It's dastardly task, but you're right, Jack. That's the kind of work we do, but nevertheless, it's immensely fascinating. If it keeps me going for 50 years, and I still every now and then, as I said in the last program, run upstairs to my wife and say, "You're not going to believe what I found this time." And she, "What is it this time?" It has to fascinate us to keep us going, Jack, that long.
Yeah, indeed. But I think it's going to be another 50 years before we can begin to then answer the question of when the Gospels were written. Because I think until we answer the Marcionite question, which I think is going to come out in Marcion's favor, which and if that's true, if it does come out in Marcion's favor that his Gospel is the earlier or shows earlier signs than Luke, right? So Luke shows more signs of being interpolated than Marcionite does redacted. That
Well,
immediately puts
there's a good
puts
case
faith.
for that. The Gospel of Luke, the author, I'm going to use she, in honor of Joan Taylor. She admits herself that she cobbled it together from a number of earlier sources. And while I'm not a Lucist, I'm not a Marcionist, I'm a Johnist, but I tend to agree that Marcion very likely was one of those antecedent sources that the author of Luke put into her work. But I can't prove that.
Sorry, so say that again. So you think that Luke, she, whoever she might be, let's call her Thecla. You think that Thecla used Marcion in the end?
I think that's a likely possibility. I'm not a Luke scholar. That's what I'm trying to emphasize.
So eventually,
but when I think about Luke, when I look at Luke, when I look at Marcion's Gospel, that's the thinking that I have is Luke freely admits that she used a number of antecedent works. And in her dedication to Theophilus, she suggests that she has cobbled together what she believes is the best telling of the story by using these earlier materials. And I believe that amongst those is some form of what we now know as Marcion's Gospel.
So by definition, then, Luke is 2nd century.
But by definition, yeah, that Luke would come a good bit later. That throws out Joan's argument that it's Thecla, because Thecla is mid 1st century.
Yeah, well,
but we don't. I don't know. This is just that's the sense I get, is that Luke could borrow from Marcion's material. Yet Joan makes a good argument. Somehow it'll all work out. But you're right. It's going to take a lot more effort on all of our parts. Each of us playing that role.
That's interesting, though, because you've raised then a load of serious thoughts in my head. Is that so we agree now Luke is 2nd century?
Yeah, I see Luke, and my reason for that is not so much the Marcion question as it is the secret Gospel of Mark question.
Okay, so then where does Matthew fit in? Does Matthew influence Marcion and Luke, or just Luke, or does Matthew predate Marcion?
I consider Matthew to be very late 1st century, such that it uses the secret Gospel of Mark as well. The antecedent fragments, the little bits and pieces that we have quoted from the so-called Gospel of Hebrews, the Gospel of the Egyptians, etc., as well as the fascinating story that Epiphanius tells about his friend Joseph and this library that has in it quote-unquote Hebrew gospel, and the extremely interesting description thereof. These materials feed into my conclusion that Matthew is earlier than Luke, but still a good bit later than the others. Around the end of the 1st century, the beginning of the 2nd century is where I would place Matthew.
And so Matthew makes for the first time the birth narrative in that case.
Yes.
And then Luke knows Matthew and ignores him, or doesn't know Matthew and creates his own one?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, so obviously for Matthew, Jesus is born in Nazareth, and he has the whole Joseph styley stuff. He talks about the angel appearing, but where Luke takes the Marian side of it, Luke talks about the angel Gabriel appearing, and we have the Magnificat and the visitation. So when we're looking then so Luke's now evolved from some of Marcion stuff perhaps in the 2nd century. How does Luke then treat Matthew in this relationship? Because either he has Matthew and ignores his birth narrative and prologue, and then makes up his own, which contradicts Matthew's, or he doesn't have it.
Yeah, you're assuming that Luke is aware of Matthew.
Well, I know. I'm asking you. Do you think he does or he doesn't have it? Because he either does have him, and ignores him. He doesn't have it. They're the only two options, I think. They're the only two options, I think, aren't they? Because either he has Matthew and he says, "Hey, I like your birth narrative, Matthew, but I want to make up another one that's more Marian focused," or he doesn't have it and then thinks, "Actually, I need to create one because Marcion didn't give me one."
Or it comes from some other source. I personally, again, I'm emphasizing, I am not a synoptic scholar. I'm a John scholar. but I personally believe Luke was not aware of Matthew. I find both of them relatively later. This is something Joan has talked about as well. The village of Nazareth did not exist, so far as we know, until a good bit later than the 1st century, until we come into the time that Matthew and Luke were written. Nazareth and in fact, let me bridge on that for a moment. In the Galilean Aramaic, the spelling of Nazareth as a village is with a sit, which is a kind of an explosive S. And the word for Notzrim, those who take the Nazarite vow, is written with a Z, which is like our modern Z. They're completely different words, but that the village of Nazareth was probably named for Notzrim. It was probably headquarters for the Notzrim. I don't remember which archaeologist it was, but there are caves found around there that were filled with a number of survival materials that suggest very possibly it was a locus of the Notzrim, in contrary to the Roman overlordship. But getting back to the point, the very fact that these towns are given names, Nazareth, Cana, Bethlehem, these suggest a later origination of those two gospels, the very birth narratives and their uses of these names. So I see Matthew as late and Luke as later yet, although certainly contains a good deal of earlier information, earlier material.
Okay, so okay, that's interesting, I think. But then let's move to John then, because that's your home. Let's go into the wheelhouse, as it were. An Englishman using the term wheelhouse always feels wrong.
I feel like I'm going way out on a limb when I talk about the synoptics, because that's simply not my area.
To be fair, it's not mine either. I just pitch in. So let's go to John then. So I mean, if John is that early, again, we ask the question of, well, where does he get his resurrection narrative from? Because again, he differs from everyone else. And if he has the same sources as maybe the earlier fellows, then how does he get it so wrong? Or at least so different, maybe. Let's go with how so different. And even maybe self-contradictory. I mean, many women come, one woman talks, the rest seem to have faded into the background. Where does he get this from? How has he got it so different? And isn't it strange that the main bulk of the problems with the synoptics and John is around the birth and the resurrection narratives, whereas the only person who seems to have a consistent version of this is Marcion. He seems to be the only person who wants to present at least a cohesive picture. The rest of them just panic and maybe Mark could be the exception, but mostly just faff around and create their own and make it up and differ from everyone else. So is it the case that John is lying, creating, mythicizing, perhaps is a generous way of putting it? I don't know which one the answer is in your version.
Yeah, the Aramaic text does not have the issues in the Greek text to which you referred.
Okay.
Mary does not speak in the first person plural, for example. She doesn't say, "We do not know where they have put him." The text gives us quite a great deal of difference. There, I'm pulling up my Aramaic as we speak. When she goes in verse 2 of chapter 20 to Simon, she says, "They raised up the master from the body, and there is no one there who knows where they have placed him." It's the "we" issue that we have in the Greek simply disappears. Now, of course, the Gospel of John claims that the beloved disciple is the eyewitness source of much of the material in the gospel, and that beloved disciple is identified as female. The Aramaic language uses declensions much more precisely than Greek, and the beloved disciple is shown by the verb declension and the what's the other word I went? The declensions on adjectives as being female, and her identity is quite easily established in the Galilean Aramaic, and she is the woman who comes to the tomb and interacts with Jesus at the tomb in chapter 20. So that all suggests that she, the woman in chapter 20, is indeed the eyewitness source that is used. So to answer your question, where does it all come from? It comes from an eyewitness.
Because it says it does.
Well, that's what we have to go on. Until my time machine is back from the shop, that's the best I can do.
I mean, I accept. Look, I am being overly critical to some extent, but I do think that it seems a hell of a coincidence to me that nobody can get this birth and resurrection narrative right, and that also simultaneously, or just post the event of these gospels being supposedly written, none of the apostolic fathers seem to know about it or are that interested in it. And then all of a sudden, after the resurrection is put into place and Gnosticism becomes a prominent discussion, then all of a sudden, birth narratives are spoken in plenty. Resurrection is trying to be reclaimed by proto-Catholics. This all seems too coincidental to me to just be a, well, we had collective amnesia as early followers of Jesus, and we forgot about some of these really significant issues. But give us another 30 years, all of a sudden, after one heretic goes bonkers and gains some traction, we're going to join in the party, the Anastasis party, or perhaps even the birth party. In addition to that, I think it's also important to look at the creedal statements that are going around at this time. You know, the only thing that you're required to believe in the earliest creeds we have is natus et passum, right? We want birth, we want crucifixion. Again, the resurrection, even the early creeds, doesn't play a part in what we're talking about to be a believer in early Christianity. Again, this seems to fly counter to what Paul wants us to think. Paul is Mr. Resurrection. The Gospels also it's sort of the high point, perhaps, of the narrative is the great resurrection after the misery of they were afraid at the crucifixion. I don't think that we can claim this as collective amnesia that's going on, and the facts they differ. There's too many elements for it to be coincidental, I think, and therefore to claim earliness. If one wants to claim earliness, then we must accept also the principle of collective amnesia for almost 100 years, or well, less than 80 years. That seems to be the argument that we're told.
Yeah, well, the birth narratives, I tend to agree with you. Those are, as far as I'm concerned, later insertions, later elements put into these texts as justification. You know, Jack, as well as I do, that there was quite a lot of controversy. Celsus comes to mind immediately as one of the very erudite, very thoughtful critics. Origen really can't do much about Celsus because his arguments are so good. But there was a great deal of argument about Jesus, his nature, whether he was a person of worth or whether he was a shyster. Well, that's what the argument is about. And so there was a certain amount of justification that we find in the later versions of these gospel texts. Excuse me, my cat wants to be let out. Here's my cat on this History Valley channel.
Probably the most sensible one among us.
So there's a certain amount of justification that we find in the later insertions into these gospels to justify Jesus as a worthy figure, worth the respect, at least, if not the deification that was put on him by the later dogma. So, in that point, I agree with you. These birth narratives are to that purpose, to help put an underline beneath Jesus and say he is worth your adoration.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, but again, it seems to me that where I thought you started this discussion is not where you've ended in some sense. Like it seems to me that we're pushing more and more parts of the gospel into the 2nd century, including John. Right? It seems to me that we're saying that some of the birth narratives problematic.
I'm not saying that of John.
Okay, so but if you also said that
birth narratives I see as a relatively late addition to these texts. But the John text, as we have it, the Textus Receptus of the Greek, that still I see as relatively late in the 1st century. By what we have of Papias, it suggests that Papias, when it was returned, when the original Galilean Aramaic manuscript of John was returned from Sinope and Pontus in the about early years of the 90s, it fell to Papias. John was still alive. He was amazingly enough still alive, but apparently in very poor shape. And it fell to Papias of Hierapolis to translate these Aramaic texts into Greek and provide some brief bridge narratives to create a coherent narrative gospel. And that was done relatively late, but it was still done, as far as I can tell, within the 1st century.
But unless you find Papias, I don't know what was in it.
Some people date Papias much later. I've seen like 120 or so.
I don't. So I'm actually a big I really trust in Papias. The problem is I don't know what I'm trusting in because I haven't got it. So I believe all the story. I think Papias may have met Old Man John. Papias may have known Old Man John's texts. Doesn't mean he knew the prologue. Doesn't mean he knew the resurrection narrative. It doesn't mean he knew a systematized gospel, because no one else indicates that exists. I think he might also have the sayings of John. Hey, my name's John, and I saw Jesus walk by and give a sermon about this, that, the other. I saw a parable given. There's no evidence of systematized gospel. There's no evidence of this great logos theology. You see the issue again. It's like it's an argument built on sand again. I don't know what's there, and if we claim we do know what's there, it's beyond speculation. We don't know. We just don't know.
Papias is late, and as I read the changes between the Greek and the Aramaic, I see a lot of dogmatic change that I would personally put at the feet of Papias. You bring up the prologue, the structure of the prologue, as you know, with certain prose interpolations referring to John the Baptist or John the Immerser, suggests to me that it was earlier and that these were marginal comments about John, marginal revisions in the Aramaic that Papias, as he does elsewhere in the text, simply inserted into the main body of textual material at the nearest geographical point, which was his way of doing it. It would not be our modern way of doing it, but that suggests to me that indeed the prologue is early. So I'm not discomforted by the prologue whatsoever.
I can't see it. I don't know where it is. I can't find it.
I understand.
You might be right. I'm not disagreeing with you. You could well be right.
And you could well be right too.
Well, but I'm not. That's the subtle difference, though, is that I've not posited anything. That's the careful element that I have in this. I'm even more cautious than Joan. I don't say anything at all. I just right. What I do is
you see a lot for nothing.
yeah. Well, that's what we get paid for.
Just joking. Don't take it seriously.
It's what we get paid for, right? But what I see is this is the day I can tell you it is. Right. This is the day I can tell you something exists. But any claim earlier, to me, is one step away from fantasy, because you lack the paleographical, the paleographical, the attestations. You lack everything necessary to jumble an argument together, and I think you only get away with that in New Testament study. I think that that is a genuine flaw we have as a community, as scholars, is that with such hypothesis you only get away with that because of our field. I think if you were in fact, I gave a paper about the reception of Paul in the genuine letters of Ignatius, which I believe to be the 3-letter collection, and it's really interesting because everyone hated it. Yeah, I was basically, I mean, I thought there was going to be a tomato thrown at the end, but there wasn't, praise God. But an Old Testament colleague came up to me and said, it's really interesting that you said that about what we classify as literary dependency or an attestation, because I've always wondered in why in New Testament study that we classify two words, if they use two words the same as Paul, we classify it as an attestation of 1 Corinthians, right? It's just two similar words. You'd never get away with that in some of our Hebrew Bible stuff, right? And I think that's symptomatic of also the argument debate we're having, is we are so liberal in our acceptances of what is basically a baseless assumptions. I think I don't mean to say that as in like, that there is no arguments, but I do think if you were in science or in history or classics, I think they'd probably laugh some of my colleagues off stage for saying, I think it's true because it says it was written by this person, and because it looks early, and because it doesn't mention the falling of the temple, and it does mention a figuration of a city. Okay, and their immediate question is going to be, okay, show me your tangible evidence, and we can say, oh, I can't. Whereas if you ask me to show tangible evidence for the reception of Marcion, or the 3 letters of Ignatius, or Polycarp, or 1 Clement, I can say, yeah, here you go. There you go. There they are. Here's people that are talking about them. But no one else can in the New Testament area. Paul, maybe. Paul, maybe we could talk about Paul. But what recension of Paul, again, we've got an issue. But in the Gospels, I can't give anyone any tangible evidence to say, here you go check it out.
It's interesting, Jack, because my perspective on our colleagues is rather different. I see a vast amount of caution, a vast amount of repeating generation after generation the same hypotheses that have been promoted before, and there's still a great deal of focus, especially in Western scholarship. Not so much, because where I live in Panama, obviously I get exposed to a great deal of non-English speaking scholarship. I also keep close with the French, the German, the Dutch scholars as well, and as I'm saying, predominantly in the English-speaking scholarship, there's a certain amount of that caution, a tendency to repeat the dicta of the earlier generations of scholars. And I see a hesitation, as I mentioned, Metzger and Brock had in front of them the Galilean manuscripts, the Palestine lectionaries, the Syriac Sinaiticus. You say it. Syriac Sinaiticus. There we go. And yet chose to ignore them. This colophon that is on so many Aramaic manuscripts, referring to the manuscript of John that was accessible in Ephesus for centuries thereafter. Peter of Alexandria refers to seeing it, I think, in the beginning of the 3rd century. I'm sorry, the beginning of the 4th century. Still apparently there. But there seems to be a hesitation to look at an abundant amount of resource material that is before them, but they want to stay with the Greek. They want to stay with the familiar territory that their scholars, that their antecedent scholars, their teachers taught them. And what I'm trying to do, and I respect the perspective you said, Jack, but what I'm trying to do is to take a fresh look, a new look, as if this were Homer, as if this were Plato, as if this were Sappho or some other author than these texts that are so revered in the world, and simply look at them as texts, see what we've got, see if I can put together another theory of origination that explains how they came to be in the way in the form that we have them today. And I think I've got something. It will be published soon. It's going to be, my publisher hates my guts. It's going to be in 8 or 9 volumes. It looks like more than 5,000 pages.
As a PhD student, you're one of my worst nightmares. Because it's like, which volume do I look in? Where is it?
you I'm sure you read Hans Küng and all the other great scholars in German. I'm going to put them to shame, and I'm only in English.
It's best not
It's
to.
hard going, but this is, Jack, what's necessary. If I have to show the holes in the arguments, the difficulties in all the standard explanations, and present a new theory, it takes a great deal of work to do that. So that's why the length of the work. But I think it's worth the effort that I've put into it, and I'm feeling better and better about it as I look at it with I'm my own worst critic, and as I look at it with critical eyes, I keep saying this is a pretty solid argument. So I'm sorry, Jack, because you don't have it in front of you. You're not familiar with my work, I believe. And but I think it is a convincing scenario for how at least the Gospel of John came into the form in which we have it. And it does refer now and then to the other synoptic Gospels and the non-canonical Gospels as well. And then they think of coherent manner, including Marcion.
I would agree with you that scholars are, particularly over the last 20 years, open to discussing slightly more radical theories. But one thing I do notice, though, is that the issue is not so much where they originated from, right? People love an argument about Q. They love an argument about L and M and Z and Y and P and every other 26 letters of the alphabet, right? They love all that. But when you begin to say, and this is where I do notice the difference, when you begin to say, and I've noticed this at conferences where I've been to, and they're not conservative conferences per se, is I think the second century, the Gospels find their home in the second century. I think canonical Paul finds its home in the second century. People don't entertain you. They're not interested. They really aren't interested. And I think that's one of the fundamental shifts of scholarship is going to be over the next 50 years, is that as more work is done on Marcion priority and on Marcionite Pauline priority, that is when the real debate is going to be had. Debating the LMQPZY, or whether it was written between 60 and 120, depending on what gospel or Pauline, well, not Paul, but on the gospel, you can sort of get away with that, right? If I went into an academic conference and John was written in 75, John was written in 120, I could probably get a hearing from both sides of an argument. If I say John is written 160, everyone loses their minds. People don't want to hear it. And that 40 years is the fundamental difference between what I'm talking about. And I'm willing to hear out the other side. I think that there is some discussion to be had about early dating, but like I say, until we get tangible evidence, I don't think as historians we can be so. And when I said the word assured of our position, I don't mean between 60 and 120. I mean so assured our position that it can't be 160. That's where I find the certainty element to it. Right, that's where you find the certainty element. You know, Irenaeus, you can't have John around Irenaeus, right? You can't write John around the time of Irenaeus. That just doesn't fly. That's where
Never were invited to the same party.
But that's where the certainty comes from for me, that I find so difficult. Yeah. Again, if I could totally understand if I said John was written, 1655, then I would accept at least some stick. But those 40 years are the difference between general scholarly acceptance and engagement and you're a quack. And I don't entirely think that's fair. I think that's now beginning to change and is getting more hearing.
Yeah.
We're still not at the point where it's being actively properly engaged, I don't think. But I think, like I said, in the next 50 years, I don't just see an engagement. I predict, with my prophet's hat on, a reversal of where we are in terms of dating. But we'll see. We'll see. I mean, I don't think either of us will probably live to see the conclusion of the debate, but hopefully we might live to see the beginnings of the proper fuller, franker debate. And that's also partly on the fault of Marcionite scholars. It's also, to be clear, I mean, we've not been doing that all this long properly. Obviously, Harnack wrote his wonderful volume on Marcion, which is magnificent, although in German it literally makes me want to pull my eyes out. But that is essentially all we had on it properly, and even that wasn't fully engaged. And that's partially because, again, we haven't reconstructed the text in enough detail, because that's an extremely difficult job through a load of people like Tertullian and all the other friends. So only when we do that, then we can begin to discuss the question of Marcionite priority. But that first, these have to come in steps. We can't just jump to the end.
Yeah, I as an individual applaud your efforts, Jackson, and I want to see more exploration of all of the issues you're raising. Later dating, Marcion, all of that needs to be explored. I couldn't possibly agree with you more. Whether you and I agree on various matters is irrelevant to that.
Yeah.
As Jacob knows very well, I take the Platonic view that it is through sharing our perspectives. You and I right now are on a split screen. You here, you're there, and together we help to complete a larger picture. My picture, your picture, add to that larger perspective, and it's through the reflection with each other that I think we grow and gain a better insight into the whole story. So I applaud your efforts because I need them. People who agree with my dating don't teach me anything. You do. No, they don't. I can't stand it when somebody says, "Yeah, I read your article on Bibbidi Bop and I agree with it." So what?
Now what?
But if they come back and say your argument is crazy and here's why, that teaches me something. So I need people like you, Jack. I need people like Joan. I need these scholars who challenge the perspectives I have so that I can review them, consider them over again, review the evidence, what I may have of it, and see if I still come to the same conclusions after reflecting about what they said in response. I need that. So
Yeah,
I
I agree.
applaud your efforts.
And I agree, and I am so grateful for your attitude and position in that. I mean, as I said, I mean, you can get quite a rough ride if you say certain things still. And so, this sort of dialogue. Ultimately, I remember hearing from a friend of mine that scholarship actually is a team sport. It's not a solo sport, but yet sometimes our egos fall into a solo sport.
Unfortunately, it's highly competitive to the
Yeah, well,
degree that I'm not going to name names, but I have personally heard some very well-known names speak to me horrible statements about their colleagues that they have no business stating, trying to ruin the reputation of person X with rumors that they can't support. I have myself been treated horribly by scholars simply because they think I disagree with them and therefore I'm an enemy who must somehow be professionally executed. This is largely, however, I want to note this is largely only in the English speaking community. The reception I get from French speaking scholars, German, Dutch, Spanish is entirely different. There I've received a great deal of welcome. They want to know what I think. Whether or not they agree is secondary to their desire to hear what I have to say. And I think it's that publisher perish, that competitiveness for the relatively few positions that are disappearing even as we speak in English speaking universities that causes this nastiness that I deplore. And it is for that reason I again emphasize I eagerly look forward to hearing from people who disagree with me, and I applaud their efforts to do so.
Yeah, it's super sad what you just described in the state of scholarship. I've finished my PhD, probably going to be submitting in January, and it looks like I'm going to have to leave because jobs just aren't there, and it's awful in the English speaking
Tell me
world.
about it. I had to hold on to my teeth just to keep teaching, but now in retirement, you can look forward to this, Jack, someday. Now in retirement, on a fixed income, that's why I live in Panama. It's cheaper. But here on a fixed income, I can now work 12 to 14 hours a day on the Gospel of John and no issues. I don't have to report to anybody. I don't have to worry about my career. I don't have to worry about publishing some kind of controversial statement and have people question whether or not I should still be teaching students. I can say what I think. And to me, it's a blessing. It's a joy. I can do this. I can confer with scholars who agree or disagree with me, who are at least willing to converse with me on these matters, and have a joy as a result. So you have that somewhere in your future, Jack, to look forward to.
I hope so.
Well, that was certainly a fascinating discussion to listen to, and I'm sure the audience found it in the same way as I did. And I thank both of you for joining me today. This is definitely a fascinating topic, and I have no doubt I'll most likely be moderating similar debates in the future because the dating topic is definitely really kicking off lately.
Yeah.
And thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Let me just take a look at these couple of super chats real quick.
And Jack,
Relsh
while
back
he's taking a
Gammon,
look,
thank you
Jack,
for your
stay in
super
touch,
chat.
Jack. I hope to hear from you in the future.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Benjamin Love, thank you for your super chat, and happy Thanksgiving to you too.
No, we're English. No, thank you.
But I was saying it back to Benjamin Love. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll see everybody later.
Thank you.
Great.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.